Okay, our recording's in progress. Good evening, Howard County Democratic Central Committee and guests. Welcome to our monthly scheduled July Howard County Democratic Central Committee meeting. We are very delighted to be meeting at the start of our meeting with candidate for governor, Mr. John King, former Obama Secretary of Education. And he's here with us. Thank you for being here with us, sir. We're going to offer him about 10 minutes to share his candidacy with us, why he's running for governor. Then we'll open it up to Central Committee for those that have questions to ask, offer Mr. King any questions you may have. And then we'll end the recording, and then we'll move on to some great words and hear from Senator Katie Hester. So without further ado, please welcome candidate for governor and former Obama Secretary of Education, Mr. John King.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity to join all of you. Thought I'd start by talking a little bit about why I decided to run and then talk a little bit about some of the things I hope to accomplish. So the reason I'm running for governor has everything to do with the reason I got involved in public service as a teacher to begin with. And it's really the experiences I had as a kid. I grew up with two parents who were educators. School was very much focused in my house as a kid. But my parents couldn't have known the difference that schools would ultimately make in my life. They both passed away when I was a kid. My mom passed away when I was 8. She had a heart attack, October of my 4th grade year. I lived with my dad. My dad was struggling with undiagnosed Alzheimer's, and he passed away when I was 12. And that period, especially when it was just my dad and me, was incredibly difficult. I know what my father would be like from one night to the next. Some nights he was angry, some nights he was sad, some nights he talked to me, some nights he wouldn't, some nights he was violent. The thing that saved me was school. Amazing public school teachers who made school a place that was safe and engaging and compelling. And I struggled. I struggled in high school. I struggled so much, I actually got kicked out of high school. I would say I'm the first US Secretary of Education who have been kicked out of high school. But again, it was teachers and counselors who were willing to give me a second chance. They could have looked at me and said, here's a Black Latino young man, family in crisis, going through trauma, and they could have given up on me, but they didn't. They chose to invest in me. And because of that investment, I became a teacher and a principal and spent my career in education and had the honor to serve as Secretary of Education for President Obama. And as I went through my career as an educator, one of the things I was always so conscious of was how kids and families were so deeply impacted by other systems, whether or not their family has access to safe and affordable housing, whether or not they have access to healthcare, whether or not the parents can find good jobs, whether or not they have a family member who's been part of our system of mass incarceration in this country. All of those other systems impact kids and families deeply. And I have, throughout my career, worked on those other issues at the intersection of education and criminal justice reform, education and climate, education and housing, education and transportation. And when COVID hit, I decided to start a progressive advocacy organization in Maryland called Strong Future Maryland to work on ensuring an equitable recovery and to really grapple with the fact that it's not good enough to just go back to how things were in February 2020, but we really need to think about how do we build a more just future going forward. And so I started Strong Future Maryland to try to tackle some of these other issues that intersect with education. So we worked on the blueprint and HBCU funding, core education issues, but we also worked on social safety net issues like worker protections and protecting folks from eviction. We worked on economic development issues, worked closely with Speaker Jones on a Black economic agenda focused on how we grow African-American entrepreneurship in the state. We worked on issues of climate and environmental justice. And through that work, I became convinced that the next governor is going to be uniquely positioned to move the state forward on critical issues, missed opportunities that we have as a state, the fact that we don't have paid family leave, that we don't have universal access to affordable quality childcare, the fact that we haven't made the investments we should in education. We've made a set of commitments with the blueprint, but we now have to follow through on those commitments and make sure that the resources are there. I think about the economic development opportunities we have that we aren't taking full advantage of. We aren't driving the kind of job creation and economic opportunity that we should in the state that gives people access to a good quality of life. We aren't doing enough on affordable housing, on public transit. So many opportunities in the state for state government to be a force for good in people's lives. And that's ultimately what's driving me to run. When we see this in Howard County, I'm thinking today, particularly about some of the climate issues that we're grappling with. The fact that there's flooding in Ellicott City is an indicator that climate is a today problem, not a tomorrow problem, and needs immediate, ambitious action. We should be among the first states to get to net zero greenhouse emissions, and we are not on track to do that. The next government can put us on the right track, and that's what I would intend to do. So ultimately, again, I'm running because I think government, state government, can be a powerful force for good in people's lives, the way public schools were in my own. I'll close with this, and then eager to hear your questions and reflections. You know, I'm sitting in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I live with my wife and daughters. We're about 25 miles from where my great-grandfather was enslaved. And the property where he was enslaved with his family in Gaithersburg, Maryland, is still owned by the family that are direct line descendants of the family that owned my family. And I've had the opportunity to get to know them, to become friends with them, to spend time on the property. And when you're standing on that property, the cabin actually, where my great-grandfather lived as an enslaved person, his family is still standing. Standing inside that cabin, I've had the opportunity to contemplate two things. One, the cruelty and intimacy of the institution of slavery. I mean, that cabin is not 30 yards from the main house. These were two families living together in the same space, but one owned the other. And so much of that history shapes so many of the inequities that we are still struggling with today. So I'm very conscious of that. And that's one of the things you think about in that cabin. But the other thing I think about when I spend time in that cabin with my family is that in 3 generations, our family went from enslaved in that cabin to serving in the cabinet of the first Black president. And that's an illustration of the kind of progress that is possible if we create paths to opportunity. And that's ultimately what I want to accomplish as governor, make sure that every kid, every family, and every community in the state has access to opportunity. And I think state government can play a critical role in that. So with that, I would love to hear folks' questions and reflections.
Thank you, Mr. King. We really sincerely appreciate that. I'd like to turn it over to Central Committee members with their questions and to keep us going. So I'd like to turn it over to any Central Committee folks for questions. Any hands up? All right, I see Miss Jessica Nichols, Central Committee member Jessica Nichols. Please go ahead.
Good evening, Mr. King. I'm super excited that you're here this evening. I am a high school teacher here in Howard County, along with being a member of the Central Committee. And I wanted to ask you a very quick question. As you know, unfortunately, just like it is around the country, Maryland is no different. The zip code that you live in oftentimes determines the quality of the educational experience that you have. And so what I wanted to know is, what is your plan to ensure equity in Maryland's educational system?
Yeah, well, it's a hugely important question. So since the end of the administration, I've been running an education civil rights organization called the Education Trust. What we do is work on education equity issues for low-income students and students of color. As you know, as a teacher, there is no one silver bullet solution. Certainly, the funding that is promised in the blueprint could take us a long way. The investment in improving teacher pay and making all of our high poverty schools community schools with linkages to community services, the investment in professional development for teachers, including national board certification, the investment in universal, getting us closer at least to universal pre-K 3 and pre-K 4. Those are a good start, but I would say to folks, the blueprint should be the floor, not the ceiling. That if we really want to get to equity, we also have to tackle the birth through 5 continuum. So we have to think about early childhood. more broadly and make sure that folks have access to affordable care. We've got to think about how we diversify the teaching profession. As a country, majority of our kids are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are African-American men. We have a long way to go. We have a lot of opportunity in the state. Certainly with the 4 HBCUs, we could be developing a much more diverse teacher pipeline than we have today. We have to think about supports for English learners, a growing population throughout the state, where we don't have enough bilingual teachers. We don't offer enough bilingual services to families. So we've got to have an ambitious plan, but it starts with the next governor making sure that we follow through on the commitments in the blueprint. And the history, as you know, of school funding reform is governors and states not following through on those commitments. You know, a big fanfare when the bill is passed, but then the money never actually comes. And so first and foremost for the next governor is delivering on the promised funding from the blueprint.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Jessica. Next up, we have Central Committee member, Mr. Tim Latimer. Tim, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Mr. King, for joining us. Really a pleasure to have you with us. I appreciate very much your mention of the climate change issue. It really does resonate here in Howard County. And as I'm sure you know, Maryland is one of the states that's most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about your vision for how Maryland can really accelerate climate action over the coming decade, which is hugely critical. And in particular, also how we can do so in a way that also advances climate justice, creates jobs, lifts people out of poverty, and really shows that we can tackle environment and climate issues and at the same time grow the economy.
Yeah, such an important point. And you know, one of the things I appreciate about President Biden, when he talks about climate, he always talks about the opportunity to grow green jobs. I think it's very important as Democrats that we don't let people pit economic development and climate against each other. They actually are deeply interconnected. Some of the things I think we need to do, and again, there's no silver bullet, but we need to go all in on renewable energy, which means certainly wind, and we hear lots of candidates talking about wind, but it also means solar. It also means geothermal. We should start with all of our public buildings. I co-chair a national commission on K-12 climate action with Christy Todd Whitman, who was President Bush's EPA administrator and was governor of New Jersey. And on that commission, what we talk about is that public buildings should be leading the way. We should ensure that all of our public buildings are operating on renewable energy. We should move all of our school buses to electric. We have 480,000 school buses in the country. We should move all of those to electric. We should move our public bus fleet to electric. We should move all of our state buildings and our state vehicle fleet over to renewable energy. That would be a good start. Our new buildings should be required to move as quickly as possible towards renewable energy. We should be making big investments in public transit. One of the biggest mistakes, and there are many, of the Hogan administration was canceling the Red Line project in Baltimore City. Public transit is part of our economic development strategy and part of our climate strategy. We should build the Red Line, finish the Purple Line, expand the MARC service, increase MARC service, build the Southern Maryland Light Rail project. We should have more buses around the state, particularly in rural areas, help folks get to work, get to the doctor. But we can do all of that in a way that is going to help us meet our climate goals. But I think it starts with committing that climate is a today problem, not a tomorrow problem, and therefore we should be one of the first states to get to zero greenhouse gas emissions. And that's going to require a whole of government strategy. Hopefully we'll have some help at the federal level. I'm glad that Senator Van Hollen and Senator Cardin are taking the position that we shouldn't do infrastructure without climate, because wouldn't be serious about our challenges. Hopefully we'll get some federal help that will help us accelerate our efforts on climate. But we should be leading on this issue in Maryland. As you say, we're amongst the most vulnerable states. We could be a national model for how to move towards zero emissions.
Thank you so much. We're only going to take our last question from Dr. Lillian Holmes, and then we'll have to wrap this up. So Dr. Lillian Holmes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Welcome, John, if you
Thank you.
don't mind me calling you that.
That's fine. Thank you.
I am an educator myself, a professional educator with 40 plus years from grades K through 16. So I would like to ask you specifically about the school systems. As you know, they are ranked in Maryland from 1 through 24, and specifically Prince George's County, Maryland, and Baltimore City. They usually rank from the bottom. And as you have had experience nationally and now running for governor, I would like to know, what would your first 100 days in office look like as you approach to help the school systems that cannot seem to have elevated themselves from the bottom of the list?
Yeah, yeah. Such an important question. Well, and one of the things that has driven that problem is underinvestment, particularly in Baltimore City and Prince George's County. That's something that the blueprint addresses. And so we got to make sure that the resources are there. But it's not just how much you spend, it's also how well you spend. And we ought to be investing much more in community schools models, where we're connecting students and their families with support services, whether it's mental health services, adult education for parents, after school and summer programming, especially as kids recover from COVID. We have kids who have missed a lot of instructional time, kids who've been isolated from peers and teachers at school. We have to address that. I think we ought to mobilize a state tutoring corps to get as many kids matched up with tutors, whether it's recent college graduates or retired teachers, who help them make up some of the ground that they've lost because of COVID. We ought to be doing much more around teacher training on reading in particular. As you know, as an educator, from preschool through third grade, you're learning to read. After third grade, you read to learn in every subject. You're not going to make progress in social studies, science, or even math if you don't have strong foundational reading skills. And we haven't done enough to support our teachers around early reading. Teacher training has to be better. Supports for our English learners have to be better. Supports for students with disabilities have to be better, to make sure that by the time students reach third grade, every student is able to read on grade level, so they're in a position to succeed in the later grades. We have to do more on the post-secondary transition side as well. We have a huge career and technical education problem in this state. I've been looking at the career and technical education programs in Baltimore City. In many of those programs, the percentage of students who graduate ready with a career credential is in the single digits. Students are enrolled in the programs, but they're not actually getting the skills they need to be able to get good jobs after high school. Now, the blueprint sets aside some resources to improve career and technical education, but that should be a big focus, along with improving the pathways for students into community colleges or four-year colleges. Again, no silver bullets, but there's a lot I think that we could get done very quickly. And now we have the resources between the blueprint and $130 billion for K-12 education in the American Rescue Plan. We have the resources. Now we have to deploy them well.
Thank you. I appreciate your response. You talked a lot about teachers, which is very good. But as you and I both know, just a comment, the teachers are limited. The leadership at the top, being the superintendents, the principals in the schools, all of that plays a very, very important role on the success of what the teachers can do, which filters down to the children and the students. So
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for your response.
Absolutely. No, you're completely right. So I was a middle school principal. I think principals have a crucial role to play. And one of the things we see in the elementary schools is a need for elementary school principals to also have more support around what good reading instruction looks like and what good early childhood education looks like. So in a lot of places, we end up with elementary school principals who don't have experience with the early grades. And so then they don't know what to look for and how to best support their teachers. You're absolutely right.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Dr. Holmes. This is going to conclude our episode. We want to thank candidate for governor, former Obama Secretary of Education, John King. Thank you again for joining us, sir. We appreciate your time here. And just looking through our episode.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. I hope folks will follow us at johnkingforgovernor.com.